Hello and welcome to the Fetal Position Podcast. I'm your host, Elijah Thompson, and this is episode number 1. And because this is the first episode, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and about what you can expect from the Fetal Position Podcast. This podcast is going to be focusing on issues that involve the fetus, things like abortion, stem cell research, genetic engineering, cloning, and things like that. I'm hoping to eventually have a segment where I talk about bioethical issues that are not primarily focused on issues surrounding the fetus, things like organ donation and things like that. I'm still tossing around ideas as to what I want to call that. One suggestion was calling it afterbirth, but well, I guess we'll see. Overall, my goal is to argue for the rights that all human beings have to not be killed. I also want to create a culture that not only wants to reduce abortion rates, but sees the unborn human children as valuable members of humanity, not because of what they can do, but because of who they are. Me personally, I am 28 years old, at least at the time of this recording. My wife and I have a delightful little boy, and we have another second little boy on the way. The reason I am doing this podcast is because I have noticed a bit of a gap when it comes to people's understanding of various things regarding bioethics. I have a 4-year degree in biology, and while I was there, I minored in philosophy, so bioethics has kind of become my thing. But that is enough about me. If you want to know more about me personally, independent of the podcast, you can find me on Twitter at ELIJIAHT, Elijah T. That's my personal Twitter account. There is a Twitter account for this podcast. It's at fetal_position. You can follow that to be able to see anything that is related to abortion, stem cell research, pretty much anything you can expect me to talk about on the podcast. I will also be tweeting about at the Fetal Position Twitter account. If by chance you are also interested in Christian apologetics and a libertarian political philosophy, you can follow the personal Twitter account that I have. But because I'm focusing primarily on abortion and other bioethical issues for this podcast, I decided to separate it. What I want to do for this episode, beyond introducing myself in the podcast, is to read something that I wrote a little while back called Abortion 101, Laying a Pro-Life Foundation. From episode 2 forward, I'm pretty much going to be assuming that the pro-life position is the correct position, but I didn't want to do that until I argued for it in a way that allowed me to assume that to be the case. The post I wrote, I can put in the show notes after this. You can find that at thefetalposition.com/1. The post I wrote does not answer every possible objection, nor does it argue for the pro-life position from every possible perspective, which is actually why I started this podcast. I want to explore pretty much anything that I possibly can in that arena. However, the post that I wrote and the episode after I finish the introduction is going to be a pro-life foundation where you can understand where I'm coming from, because what I want to do is treat all of the issues that I talk about in the future as if the unborn human being is, in fact, an unborn human being with inherent moral worth. So, without taking any more time up, I'm going to go ahead and jump into that and read that now. I will, of course, adapt it to when it is being read by me and the fact that it's a podcast rather than a blog post. But for the most part, I'm going to be reading it verbatim. January 22nd was the anniversary of the famous Roe v. Wade decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1973, which was effectively a federally signed permission slip for women to get abortions. But many people, including myself, do not agree that the issue of abortion is settled by court fiat because, well, the court was wrong. Abortion is an issue fraught with emotionally and rhetorically powerful arguments, so we have to make sure that we handle this issue with care. However, we are discussing an issue of great importance. If, on one hand, the pro-lifers are correct, then we have been allowing the systematic destruction of the most helpless member of society for the last 42-plus years. And if the pro-choicers, those in favor of abortion choice, are correct, then pro-lifers are looking to take away a woman's right to choose to have an abortion. Most of the quote-unquote street-level arguments for and against abortion are a combination of assuming what they're trying to prove, which is begging the question, personal attacks, accusatory motivational assumptions, straw men, loaded questions, and any number of other logically fallacious ways of thinking. How often have you heard a discussion on abortion where the pro-lifer is accusing the pro-choicer of hating babies and wanting to use abortion as birth control, and then in response the pro-choicer accuses the pro-lifer of misogyny and being against women's rights? In fact, if you're trying to hone your skills in logical fallacy identification, watch a popular level debate on Fox News or CNN or something, those are almost always hilariously bad, and count the number of fallacies used by both people. That's some hardcore on-the-job training, so be warned. When we are approaching the issue of abortion, we have to ask two vitally important questions. One is scientific and one is philosophical. The first one is, what is the unborn? This is a scientific question. The second one is, what exactly gives us value? This is a philosophical question. Due to the fact that this is an introductory post or an introductory episode, I don't plan on addressing all the possible objections to the pro-life position or the arguments for abortion. What I plan on doing here is laying a pro-life foundation, a foundation that can be applied when discussing the issue with those who disagree. Before we dive into the philosophical side of the question, let me just address the scientific question right away. The unborn is a human organism. There is absolutely no way for you to deny this and maintain even a modicum of intellectual respectability. Rarely do I make such authoritative statements, but in this case, it's completely warranted. When a sperm cell and an egg cell combine together, it creates a separate organism of the same species. If you think that the combination of a human sperm and a human egg makes something other than a human zygote, I don't really know what to tell you. Perhaps you should read up on some basic biology a little bit more. The full humanity of the unborn has been known for quite some time, yet one of the arguments used in pro-choice circles is that we don't know if the unborn is human. For example, Alan Guttmacher wrote a book called Life in the Making, which was published in 1933, and on page 1 he says this: "We of today know that a man is born of sexual union, that he starts life as an embryo within the body of the female, and the embryo is formed from the fusion of two single cells, the ovum and the sperm. This all seems so simple and evident to us that it is difficult to picture a time when it was not part of the common knowledge." So we've known this for at least 82 years, but let's pretend that we don't know it and run with it. Wouldn't it be safer to assume that the unborn is human and respond by giving the benefit of the doubt to life? More on this a little bit later. If you need to be reminded on how babies are made, you can watch a video it's in the blog post. It's a video from TED.com. It's a conception of birth visualized, and it's fantastic. If you want to, you can skip to 2 minutes and get right to the animation. There's an introduction, but it's a pretty informative introduction too. I'm going to jump back in now. Oftentimes, you will hear a misinformed pro-choice advocate say, the unborn is not human, with all sorts of moral indignation. When they say this, they probably don't mean that the unborn isn't a human organism. What they probably mean is that the unborn human being is not a person, a being that has inherent moral value. The question of personhood is the question of philosophy that I mentioned earlier. What exactly gives us value? It seems to me that the most straightforward and consistent way of answering the question, what gives us value, is to say that all human beings have value in virtue of the kind of thing that they are, not in virtue of the kind of function that they perform. This is not to say that non-human organisms are not valuable, but that's a completely different discussion. But why does just being human make someone valuable? That's a great question. It is because defining human value in terms of anything other than humanity would be to exclude a group of people who clearly do have inherent value. In his book, The Case for Life, Scott Klusendorf uses an acronym that describes the situation we encounter when talking about the moral worth of the unborn. The acronym that he uses is SLED, S-L-E-D. I have encountered these arguments in discussion with people myself, so I can attest to SLED's validity. The purpose of SLED is to show that the four main differences between the unborn and the born, which are size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency, do not disqualify the unborn from personhood. First one, S, is for size. The pro-choicer will often point to how small the unborn is in an attempt to show that it is okay to abort. But in what other situation do we justify the killing of a human being based on size? On that line of thinking, you are justified in killing anyone smaller than you. But be careful. I'm 6'1", 220 pounds. There's a good chance that I'm bigger than you. L is the next one, which stands for level of development. The pro-choicer will often point to how developed the unborn is and say that because the unborn has not yet developed X or Y, we are justified in killing them. Usually they'll use things like cognitive ability or sentience or even a moderately developed brain or things like that. But in what other situation do we justify the killing of another human being because they are not developed enough? As shown in the video, the one from TED, The development is a continuous process. At what point in the continuum do we point to something and declare that we can abort it today, but not tomorrow? At best, this would result in an arbitrary, subjective understanding of human value based on function. On that line of reasoning, you would be justified in killing anyone less developed than you. The next one is E, which stands for environment. The pro-choicer will often point to the location of the unborn as a reason to justify killing her. But in what other situation do we justify killing a human being because of where she is? A change in location doesn't change your worth as a human being. The 12 inches or so down the birth canal does not magically grant you some kind of moral worth that you didn't have before. And the last one, D, is degree of dependency. The pro-choicer will often point to the unborn child's dependence on her mother as a justification for ending her life. But in what other situation do we justify killing someone based on their dependence on another human being? Children are dependent on their parents for food, clothing, and shelter, but that is not an adequate justification for killing them. I heard somebody, to take a side note, I heard somebody say, if we use the degree of dependency to disqualify people from not being able to kill them, then we would have to pretty much say that it's okay to kill any child who still lives at home. I'll jump back into the article now. It's my favorite objection to the reasoning behind SLED is that while it would be unjustified to take the life of a human being based on any single one of these, it is justified to take the life of a human being when all of these are taken into account. They are agreeing with the logic behind SLED and making it a special case for the unborn. This is a logical fallacy known as special pleading. That being said, there are times when abortion is justifiable, if not essential. For example, when the unborn child implants into the mother's fallopian tube, this is called an ectopic pregnancy. If this were to happen and we do nothing, neither the baby or the mother would survive. If we abort the child, it will result in a dead child and an alive mother, and one death is better than two. Some questions and objections are easy to answer, but much more difficult to apply to real-life situations. Like, what about if a woman was raped? What if it was a mistake? What if the birth control failed? If we are totally lacking in the empathy department, and I'm not always super great at that, but I'm getting better, these questions are easily answered. Rape, mistakes, and the failure of birth control result in a valuable human being that is valuable because of what it is, not based on anything else. However, this does not help the woman in the situation. What she needs is help, not an argument. Now, I'm not trying to be unreasonably dogmatic in these situations, and I hope you can see that. Thought experiments are a common tactic used in ethical discussions like abortion, and for good reason. These thought experiments allow us to step outside of the situation and think more of a meta-issue surrounding the situation. We have to be careful with these, though, because the thought experiments may not be analogous in the morally relevant ways. While I think there are good reasons to think that all human beings are persons, there may be some people who are still unconvinced for whatever reason. Perhaps they think we can never know if the unborn is really a person. To those people, I would ask them to consider what J.W. Wartick calls the epistemic argument against abortion. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Actually, it's on the blog post, but either way, I'll put it in the show notes. If you are unsure of whether or not the unborn child is a person, why would you default to allowing it to be killed? The most reasonable and appropriately a cautious thing we can do is to default to the pro-life stance until further information is given. After all, we don't want to be complicit in the active destruction of valuable human lives simply because we are agnostic on the person in question, right? One of the analogies that he uses, actually I'm not sure if he uses it, but one of the analogies I've heard is that if you are destroying a building, if you are a demolition man, and destroying a building and someone asks, are there any people in there? And you say, I don't know, and you blow it up anyway, that would be seen as morally irresponsible, right? So why wouldn't we hold the doctors or us in general up to the same standard when it comes to abortion? You ask, hey, is there a person in there? And they say, oh, and you abort anyway. Seems morally irresponsible. So jumping back in. As I said earlier, this post was not designed to present a full pro-life case. It was meant to provide an introduction to the topic from a pro-life perspective. There are many more arguments for and against abortion that I did not address, but I will undoubtedly be doing that in future episodes. And that concludes my post called Abortion 101, Laying a Pro-Life Foundation. Just as an FYI, after I wrote this initially, I was corrected by a friend, Clinton Wilcox, who said that Scott Klusendorf was not the originator of the SLED argument. It was Stephen Schwartz in his book, The Moral Question of Abortion. There are a handful of questions on this post, too, like the comment section, and I plan on addressing those in future episodes. They are pretty good questions, so I'm actually kind of excited to be able to finally address them. It's been quite some time, actually. Yeah, one of the ones that I've been wanting to address was written on January 24th, 2015. So it's been over a year. About time I addressed those things, huh? And that actually concludes my first episode. So thanks for listening. Remember, all the relevant links can be found on the show notes at thefetalposition.com/1, because it's episode number 1. If you want to reach me for a comment or a question or an episode suggestion, feel free to reach out on Twitter at it's at fetal_position. And I also have an email address, which is at mail@thefetalposition.com. So, there we go. I'm just going to go ahead and hit the music, and I guess I'll see you guys next time. Bye.